I'm curious, how many people agree with it? Seems like a very strong statement. Everything is political. And I'm really curious how many people agree with that statement. If you agree, could you put your hands up? Everything is political. Okay, wow, seems like the majority of the people. I mean, anybody knows me, they will know that I would usually raise my hands up to that question, but I think I've been filled with a bit of doubt about whether it's a good thing for everything to be political. We know that the personal is political because of the Kombahi River Collective showing us so clearly, for example, as women, that our bodies are political, made so by those who want to control it, tell us what to do with it. I think the most horrifying case of not controlling your body must be this case of, I hope I have the name, Adriana Smith, this lady in Georgia who is legally brain dead, but the state kept her alive because at the time of her passing, she had a fetus in her, and they literally have hijacked her body despite the views and the opinions of her family and said, we'll keep her alive as an incubator. So that's just, for me, one of the latest, most extreme cases of your body being political. We definitely want citizens to be more political. I think working from civil society for years, it's been part of our raison d'etre to say, you know, we want citizens to understand that all their goals, their aspirations are tied to being active citizens, and in a way, their lives are political. But at the same time, I think my doubt has come lately from the fact that we're so polarized. And it seems everything is now political, or everything is politicized. For example, wearing masks, having vaccines have become politicized. Whether you ride a bicycle or whether you're riding a truck, it somehow says something about your politics. So I guess I'm now sort of in the middle, you know, not so sure that everything should be political or everything should be politicized. You know, some things should just be clear. But we have two wonderful people, Professor Tanya and Rosie, to share their thoughts about this heavy statement for me, everything is political. And I'll start with Tanya, we'll move to Rosie, and then we'll have a conversation and we'll open it up to you to also share your thoughts and your views on what you're hearing and what you're experiencing in line with this. So over to you, Tanya.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me here. It is a great pleasure. It's my first time in Kenya, so it just many levels of wonderfulness. I first also want to just express my gratitude to the Malunga Anti-Blackness Network. It is a global research network of which I'm a member and is sponsoring my trip here. And we are gathered as a political organization, if you might say, a political research organization, a scholar activist. And our mission is really to disrupt the normalcy of anti-Blackness that's fostered across cultures, right? And is embedded in the everyday and embedded in our families. Right? So when I think about this phrase, you know, everything is political, part of what it raises for me is the extent to which, if we want to transform and make more equal our systems and structures in our societies, that can't be mutually exclusive from the work that has to be done within families. Families are another structure, and can kind of, you know, be sometimes the site of more resistance than we might otherwise anticipate. And so in my own research, as part of this research network, I deal looking at comparative race relations, looking at how anti-Blackness sort of surfaces, and surfaces particularly comparing the Latin America and the United States. And then my most recent book looks at Latinos, which are a population of people in the United States who are either migrants from Latin America and the Caribbean, or are those whose own ancestors originally came from Latin America and the Caribbean, but who are now Americanized, right? But viewed as other. And so they use this description of Latino to describe themselves. We always have to give this little bit of an explanation. What's a Latino? That's a Latino, right? Okay. So what my own sort of, response to sort of how do we deal with this, our various moments across cultures, and finding the right avenues, as the panel wants us to talk about, to address the state of the world, is, I'm a writer, right? So I try to write my way through my own puzzlement and write my way through what I think what some answers might be, or be part of the conversation, right, to build answers, even if I don't have them all on my own. And in context of looking at this within Latino cultures and in the comparative picture, disrupting anti-Blackness means making visible those who are erased. Right? So, a couple of factoids, right? So this makes more sense. Right? Latin America and in the Caribbean, right, are often not thought about when we think about Blackness, or at least not in the United States. In the United States, people are like, well, what is that? Because in the United States, the idea is the story of slavery and the descendants of slaves, right? They are only U.S. people, right? That's their notion, right, in the U.S. And what they are completely racially illiterate about, because it's not taught in schools, right, is that 90% of the transatlantic slave trade, right, was directed towards Latin America and the Caribbean. 90%, right? And that means that all the logics, right, and the anti-Blackness, right, that sustained, right, slavery were in Latin America and the Caribbean. Right? And that even after the abolition of slavery across these various nation states, that the logics to maintain white supremacy and racial hierarchy in the absence of slavery were also sustained. Right? So when looking at this idea of one, are there black people in Latin America? There are black people, the ancestors of Africans are everywhere, right? And they are certainly quite strongly in Latin America. But nation states in Latin America also, right, in trying to make visible the invisible, were very much engaged in their attempt to maintain a racial hierarchy after emancipation of slavery, to say that there was no longer a race problem because we had no more slavery. That's it. Problem solved. And that anyone who wanted to raise these issues, well, they were the problem. They were the racists because they were bringing up the question of race. And that what they were missing was how much just all of us were all so mixed right now that, really, who's black anymore anyway? How can we figure this out? We have so much racial mixture, etc. We have racial hierarchy, but that's not really about, one's skin color. That's about some people live in a culture of poverty, and that's unfortunate. Oh, and maybe the poverty has a particular skin color, but that's just, by happenstance. Okay. So these are stories that have been told over and over again. What, though, has arisen, right, are civil rights movements of Afro-descendants across Latin America, right, speaking against that. And this is a wonderful thing. Right? But the book that I have here today, and what I want to talk to you about today, is not so much about that story. That was, a much earlier book, right? The more recent book is about how that revolution, this rising up of Afro-Latinos, right, and saying, hey, one, we exist. Two, we weren't mixed away. We're still right here in front of you, right? And we don't want to be quiet or have you quiet us, right, about the anti-Blackness that exists in our nation states. That gets completely removed from the minds, right, of Latinos in the United States. Many of them are ignorant of it or are conveniently ignorant of it, right? And so to just sort of bring this sort of an introductory remark to a close, the way in which they are ignorant of it is that crossing the border into the United States now makes them feel brand new, right? And that they are an other themselves, regardless of their appearance, right? So, you may look like you're from Sweden and have blue eyes and blonde hair. We got those too. in Latin America. But entering the United States, your surname alone, right, to be an Hernández, regardless of what Hernández looks like, is problematized in the United States. And this is true, right? But that does not mean that an Hernández who is dark-skinned and an Hernández who is light-skinned experience the world the same. It's just not. Right? And this is not trying to over-politicize, right? This is about trying to be very transparent, right, about the realities of living in a racialized world. Regardless of how you identify, it matters, right? And it's political. So, crossing the border, we're all Latinos now, suffering against anti-Latino biases. We don't see color. We don't have colors. It doesn't matter, right? And Black Latinos don't exist. Yet, within Latino culture, anti-Blackness does exist. So, what I view as the way to engage these things, right, is to raise and lift the voices of those who are the victims of the internalized anti-Blackness, right? And the way I seek to do this, right, is to say, we don't have any differences within Latinidad within the United States, yet there's a certain person who's currently the president in the United States. You may have heard a little bit about him. And many white Latinos voted him into office. Right? And they did so because of, not distracted by, but because of his white supremacist logics. Right? It was an attraction for them. Right? Many Latinos are members of white supremacist organizations and part of violent insurrections. We are also those who deny people jobs, deny them places to live, deny them access to public spaces, right, based on Blackness, right? This is both against Afro-Latinos, African Americans, Africans, and other people from the African diaspora who happen to be within the United States, right? Latinos are not exempt from these modes of racial exclusion. Right? But we don't see that because we call them all Latinos. So the book that I hopefully Book One has here today, I don't know if they got it from the United States, it's called Racial Innocence, Unmasking Anti-Latino Black Bias, is all about the storytelling, right, of these individuals who are victims, both Afro-Latino and other African descendants, right? And to give you a little taste, I'll give you just one sentence, right? Because I include sort of my family's own personal story, right? Put it towards the end because I don't want to take up space, but because it's not about me, it's about everyone else, right? But I start off that particular narrative by saying, I am the daughter of a Black daughter almost given away because of her Blackness, right? So I am the daughter of a Black mother almost given away because of her Blackness, given away in her family. And so then that sort of situates for people, oh, this is about to get real.
Thank you so much for that. You've raised so many issues that hopefully we'll have enough time to unpack. The politicization of education, for me, really, what we're taught, what we're not taught, is very political. Structural racism and how that's propagated by the fact that we don't teach certain things in school, and history is contested, and the politics of borders, the politics of skin. So we'll hopefully come back to that. But Rosie, please share with us why everything is political or not.
Thank you so much, Ayisha. Thank you so much, Doctor. Hello? Is that wonderful? Sweet. Thank you so much, Ayisha. Thank you, Dr. Tanya. And also just very wonderful to be in conversation today. A friend reminded me recently about the etymology of the word conversation, which comes from dwelling place, to be in a dwelling place together or to be in company with. So also just really wonderful to be here at a library, to be in conversation about these things. And so when I think about everything is political, I also think very much about everything being relational, as an invitation, as everything is relational. I have had the pleasure of spending so much of my days working with artists as a curator and as a bookmaker. And in my role as a curator, that involves exhibition making as well as accompanying programming for that. And as a bookmaker, working with artists on different formats. And something that has been very satisfying lately has been exploring workshops as spaces to gather, gathering even in this moment being political. Wednesday being the anniversary of the Reject Finance Bill protests, which then also galvanized around about a lot of other issues affecting the country. So also thinking about gathering as political. And maybe to zero in a little bit on the space of workshops and the long culture of artist workshops in Kenya that began in the 80s and has continued to build to this point. And workshops, again, being spaces for gathering for, yes, technical skills, but also for social skills and conceptual development. Again, this idea of what can we figure out when we are together. And so in that way, also just very excited for the broader festival, even in the context of what we are doing here together at the moment. And in the universe of workshops, my practice has also very much been around sound and zine making, sound practices, but also zine making cultures, and zine making being this DIY way in which you can make your own publications, and being able to gather around that from everything from a personal zine to more political zines. And I find this as very generative counterculture spaces, also outside kind of like mainstream publishing, to be able to share ideas, to be able to, again, be together and, yes, work through the moment. And so I found this to be very, yes, very generative in many ways. And in Tone, who isn't here with us today, and the work of Chimurenga also happens to be very generative for how a lot of artists work in the city. The Pan-African Space Station being this radio station, but also a space in which you can experiment with sound, and also to experiment with different publication formats. Yeah.
Wow, that was very short. Thank you. You've raised a few interesting points. Conversation as a duel, or I guess in being in harmony with each other. And I think it raises for me just how, we have these once a year conversations where everybody's together. And there's almost a sense that after that, the conversation sort of just evaporates, and it would be nice if we could distill some of these ideas that we talk about and sort of channel them into our lives. And so I'll stay with you, Rosie, and say, what's your thought about, you mentioned the No Finance Bill, the anniversary, the fact that there was another protest on Wednesday, more people were killed. But despite what happened last year, the horrors of last year and what has happened in between, and I have to say that Kenyans have really taught at least some of us in Africa the importance of staying the course. The citizens have sort of stayed consistent throughout the year until this anniversary where we saw even bigger numbers come out. So what's your sense of what's driving or what has driven that consistency from one year to the other?
Thank you for your question. I think for one, I think the internet is both a very generative space, but also continues to be, I think, fairly tenuous. I'm saying this as someone who has been off the internet for a few months and coming back in, also seeing seeing how information travels differently. So when you're offline, you don't necessarily have the same sense of what's happening. So I think something else that has been on my mind a lot lately has been what are the possibilities of organizing both offline and online in the ways to continue to dwell in this moment, to drive this moment. Yesterday, there was also a really wonderful workshop organized as part of the Nairobi Lit Festival around revolutionary papers and longer cultures and the historical context for which this moment is happening. So I also found that a very wonderful place to be thinking with, in that even in this moment, they are, unfortunately for us, a lot of truncated histories of what resistance has looked like since independence. I think very intentionally so, those histories of resistance being suppressed. So for me in this moment, I think being able to dwell in the idea that we are not the first, that there's a lot that we can continue to build on and learn from. I think also very heartened by the numbers, very heartened by this moment, that something that it does feel like a fulcrum moment, like quite pivotal, and more, how to say, yes, I think there's ways in which we can continue to be grounded as we move forward, and a lot of that feeling being also in the historical context of revolution movements in this country.
Thank you for that. And you've raised a very interesting point for me about the difference between online and offline, or where the two sort of intersect. Very often we find that you have these influencers. I can use myself as an example. I mean, once upon a time I had 12,000 plus followers on Twitter, now X, that I've sort of abandoned them. I haven't deleted my account, but I don't go there anymore. I don't post anymore. But I'm curious, like if there was something I cared about and I said to my 12,000 followers, come out, would they? We sort of mistake our online presence for offline influence. And the truth is, if I stood in a market square in Nigeria and said, yeah, come out, I really doubt I would get even 1,000 people. But meanwhile, online, I seem influential just by virtue of the number of people that are retweeting what I say, but it's not real influence. So I'm back to thinking that we really need to be in spaces together. We need boots on the ground. We need to hold hands. I'm no longer taken by the virtual anymore. But thank you for raising those points. And I'll come to you. Say something.
Well, yeah, so what you say sort of sparks in me a little contrarian. In the following respect, that I don't think of them as having to make a choice. That both are very important, right? Both the in-person and the virtual. And part of the reason why I am a fan of making the virtual a productive space, right? Could it be deconstructed, but it can also be very productive, is that I saw during hashtag Black Lives Matter, BLM, I don't know how much that resonates here in Kenya, but within the United States, what was quite fascinating to me was to watch the ways in which not only Twitter, but also TikTok, baby, really pushed out information in productive ways. Right? There's always the nonsense, but there's also a value that people sort of, I think, underestimate, particularly across generational lines. And that, like, I'll give you an example. This whole business about Afro-Latinidad, right? About people who identify as Black within Latino ethnicity, right? They say, I'm both of ethnicity and I'm a race. Right? This became sharper during Black Lives Matter because there were various Latino and Latino organizations, raceless ones, right? So-called raceless ones, that said, we are in allyship with Black Lives Matter. Right? We're here to support Black Lives Matter, as if they didn't have skin in the game, right? That is to say, because we're good people, we are in allyship with you, right? As opposed to, we got Black people too, And, we care about this, right? So Afro-Latinos on social media, particularly young ones, right, called them out, right? And said, that's very nice for you to be all very empathetic and all, right? But one, how about showing a little bit of that at home, right? To us Afro-Latinos, we live in very segregated communities within the United States. Anyone who's a fan of Miami, Florida, but you may have noticed that if you've traveled through Miami, that they're very segregated spaces. And even though it's viewed as the most Latin American city, right, within the United States, more Spanish is spoken than English, Afro-Latinos are not welcomed in white Latino enclaves. Right? We live with African Americans. Happily do so, but that doesn't excuse the non-welcome, right, of white Latinos. And so with hashtag Black Lives Matter, that has really grown the recognition about the anti-Blackness within Latino communities. There's much more conversation about it, so that when the Trump vote tallies came out, right, and there was all of this sort of, Latinos are the ones who are to blame for this, Afro-Latinos were the ones to be able to better end the mystification. Why? Why did they do this? We don't understand. He's very anti-immigration. Why would you all vote for this person who'd be so anti-immigration? Well, white supremacy is a very strong lever to help explain these dynamics. And Afro-Latinos probably were accorded a space that white Latino media never gave us. Right? And we were able to do it through the virtual spaces. And so I don't know if that resonates with you or not, Rosie. Sometimes the virtual, it's got its problems, right? Nothing's a utopia, but it's also a tool to kind of try to fight for some space that otherwise is not yielded to us.
Yes, for sure. I think in the language of outside the conventional mainstream spaces, I do think that it does allow, as you said, that room to be able to tell your own stories from where you are, whatever is happening. So very much in the same language of alternative, but also gathering and ability to get things across, but also to radicalize. Yeah,
it's like little mini truth and reconciliations, right there in a 2-minute TikTok.
No, absolutely. And thanks for raising that, because you're right. The online space democratizes voice. You talked earlier about the fact that many oppressed minorities or oppressed groups of people don't have the mainstream media telling their stories. They don't have the schools allowing them to teach. Critical race theory is under attack. Gender studies are under attack in America. Books are being burned, metaphorically and in reality. So, yeah, and book bunk. I know you're always trying to raise money. Maybe you should find some influencers on TikTok to sell your book, because apparently TikTok is one of the spaces that are selling the most books right now. They have book clubs and everything. So you need to find a way of tapping into that young generation, and I'm sure they'll make you move some books. But I want to stay with you. You talked about the Latinos who voted for Trump, and I agree. We all follow American politics, sadly, for better or worse. But I realized that the numbers say, and correct me if I'm wrong, that Trump had about 10% Latino voters, but Kamala had 11%. That's more. So why the focus on the Latinos that voted for Trump and not on the Latinos that voted for Kamala? That's one. And then two, we was having a very interesting conversation the other day about the troublesomeness of the diaspora. When in England, when Brexit was on the ballot, many migrants from Africa voted for Brexit. So sometimes it's not even just about the race identity, it's also economical, it's the politics of being a migrant, which is part of the everything is political. So, but just say a little bit about the Trump votes versus the Kamala votes from the Latino.
I think the reason why there was so much more media attention to, oh my God, these Latinos are the ones who are to blame for the way in which they voted, is because they're of this homogeneity picture of Latinos, right? That is to say, oh, they're all like these kind of like J-Lo, Jennifer Lopez looking types who, use a black aesthetic and are conversant, right, in black culture and occupy that space, so that they would, they're not one of us, but they're with us, and so we expect them to vote a particular kind of way. Right? And so when the vote showed a more complicated picture, right, what it raised up was the disconcerting, right, counter narrative that within this ethnic group there was racial difference, right? And that within this racial group there were spaces that were hospitable to white supremacy, right? So that the idea of, oh, white supremacy is just what we have to worry about from people who are English-speaking, white natives who you might have some Ku Klux Klan members currently or formerly, within the family tree. That's the problem, right? Of racism in the United States. That picture became a lot more complicated to think about the white Latinos as sort of, fellow allies in this business, despite the fact that it's true, right? There are plenty of Latinos who voted for Kamala and also were her supporters, were out there, doing all the things as far as trying to get her into office, right? Fundraising, etc. Now, this other layer, what does it mean to cross the border and to try to remain, right? Or to survive and be respected within that space and not target it yourself? How much do you internalize the negative, right, of a culture such that you do not vote your self-interest, right, or the self-interest of your family or people like your families, right? I think that and also your own economic self-interest, right? Yes, this is true, but it is not in the entirety of the picture, it seems to me, right? And the reason why I say that is because diasporas both harm one another at the same time that they are sanctuaries, right? And so, going back to our theme of the everything is political, right? Politics are about your choices, right? It's not necessarily your innate position, right? And so when people vote or don't vote for Brexit and the like, it's a political choice, but it's also a sense of what you vision social justice will mean, right? Moving forward. And that, I think, means that we need a lot more not also the racial literacy that I talked about, but also a sort of socio-political kind of literacy building that helps people better informed about really the choices that they're making in how they identify. To identify someone, this migrant is trying to continue to struggle to fit in where they don't want me.
Thank you. I want to squeeze in one last question to Rosie before we open it up to the audience. So I'm curious, the DEI wars seem to have been inherited by the world, at least if you look at the corporate world. Everybody's sort of stripping their websites of anything and their HR policies of anything related to DEI. I think I just read that a university president has had to step down because the Trump administration wants to investigate their DEI policies. I'm curious, has Kenya adopted this culture war, or any of the American culture wars, at least as far as DEI is concerned? And I ask that in the context also of the youth protests. When I was here last year, we heard that despite the fact that many African countries are quite ethnic, or they have their ethnic or religious divides, and obviously Kenya has it, like there's this famous saying that a lower person can be president of the US before in Kenya. But the story is that the young people are not picking up on those identity lines, fault lines, and are doing a lot better, so to speak. And do you have anything to say about that? Are the younger generation not politicizing ethnicity in the way that we have and our parents have?
I think I'll circle around it and hopefully get to your direct question, because I'm also interested in something Dr. Tanya said about like politics being about choices, and so what are the possibilities for different choices that people are making now, and to your point about around this being around ethnic lines and possibly different ways of mobilizing. In one of the conversations, also part of the literary festival is like Kenya is not Nairobi, and so also thinking around like urban versus rural ways of engaging and organizing as well. So I do think that there are ways in which there's I think there's always a wanting to belong, and so I think there's more so now organizing around being a Kenyan and what, or maybe even more specifically being Kenyan in an urban center, or at least to my understanding or reading of what's happening with a lot of the mobilizing around rejecting, or rather the state of the country more so. So in that way, I will say that there are different ways in which people are coming together that are not necessarily along ethnic lines. I would read it as such. I'm sure that there are people who there's a lot more research around this and more detailed ways in which it's possible to think about that. But to your question also about like whether some of that language around DEI is also spreading in, or rather kind of infiltrating into this space as well. I think that unfortunately for us, a lot of the policies that happen in the US continue to affect people on the continent in Kenya. I'm not sure about, I think there are ways in which, for example, the cutting of USAID has continued to affect access to medication, people losing jobs, et cetera, so maybe not necessarily in the language of DEI, but we do find how these policies continue to trickle down into our own countries and economies in that way.
Thank you very much. So we'll open it up if we can see a show of hands, anybody who wants to. And should we just take one or two and then pass them on? So if you have any questions, please just raise your hands. You just identify yourself, and you can also even tell us briefly if you agree with the statement or not. Okay, somebody at the back. Thank you.
Okay. Hello, my name is Sara. Dr. Tanya, welcome to Nairobi, bienvenida. I'm Venezuelan, living in Kenya for many years. So many of the stories, what you say about the Latinos living in Latin America and the US is very close to home for me. My question is about how do you see, like, because I think this difference of like the Latinos who vote for this president in the US, it comes most for the, like this superiority. Like if I'm a Latino who migrate through the Darien, who walk to the US and cross the border to Mexico, to walk from Venezuela, Colombia, and cross like that, and in a lower quality. I have less rights to the people who came on a plane, who have in a different social status. Maybe I enter with a tourist visa because I came for the airport and I came for a plane. So I have more rights or more status to vote, and you are less of a citizen. And at the end of the day, we are Latinos, we are from the same people. In my case, Venezuelans have been treated, all of us, as part of Tren de Aragua, of criminals. But at the end of the day, they came to the US running from the same, an authoritarian government who didn't care for the rights. So how you see that difference of the Latinos, because you migrate in a way and you in a different way, so I'm better than you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for that question. There doesn't seem to be any more, so take that.
Oh, okay. Thank you for the bienvenida. And here is what I find fascinating about that dynamic that you so accurately describe, right? Is that it builds right on top of, or you might even say emanates from, the ranking we already have of superiority across countries that is racialized, right? So that is to say, within Latin America, right, we don't say it, but we all understand it. So it doesn't need to be said, right? That is to say, the white countries are the ones that we characterize or perceive as the white ones. Argentina, Chile, etc., viewed as more cultured, more intellectual, right? The ones that have what are viewed to be a more indigenous population, right? Those, they have a very folksy culture, right? We think of their spirituality, you know, the Mayans, etc., right? So they get to be in the middle, right? Mexico's thought of that, right? And then the ones most derided, the ones thought of in the sort of most pejorative terms, are those thought of as the blacker countries, Colombia, Venezuela, and the island nations as well, Cuba, Puerto Rico, right? The way we speak Spanish isn't good enough, right? There's all this ranking that goes on. And so that culture that we already have, a racialized culture of the ranking, dovetails very easily, right, with this sense of superiority about who came on a plane and who didn't, which also kind of features into this ranking as well, right? And so for me, when I think about these issues, and I wanted to sort of come back to a question that I think Rosie was sort of implicitly throwing my way, with regards to, if I'm saying politics is also about the choices you make, how do activists engage this? How do we think? How do we puzzle that through? For me, the idea is that what we need to do is not necessarily point fingers, right? Because I often have young people who ask me, everything you say really resonates with me because I hear it in my family all the time, right? But how do I talk to my abuelita? How do I talk to my grandmother, right, about this, right? I said, well, the first thing you do is you do not point fingers at her. You do not, talk to your elders, even if you feel you have so much that you would think, it's more useful information than what she may have been harboring for all these many years. You treat her with respect, but you share with her. You share with her like these interesting things that you are observing, learning about, right? My book, The Racial Innocence, is both in English and in Spanish for this purpose, right? So that people can use it within their families and within their communities. Right? And they can say, look, these people who identify as Afro-Latino are sharing the ways in which these various things happen to them, right? When you're sharing the stories, it's, a space that people are more susceptible to being reached. No writer can write without believing that to be the case, right? No, even the most cynical of us, right? And it's also, because defenses are down when you're listening to a story, and you're just kind of like taking it in and thinking about it. It also is a way that helps transform minds, right? Because it's through the connection with the stories that you are able to sort of not think so defensively, right, about upholding your position. You feel more touched, etc. So that's kind of how I would answer you, Rosie, about that. And I don't know if you sort of wanted to circle back into that as far as sort of where your thinking is going with all of that.
Yes, I think in line with this idea of politics being around choices, I think there's also I'm hoping, or I'm reading, an openness in making different choices. I think there are also certain provocations, more so also around thinking about making different choices by way of class, and thinking more around intra-class and interclass solidarity as ways to actually move things forward, thinking around workers' movements, and maybe a little shout out to some of the work that's being done by Until Everyone is Free, which is a podcast that I also think really harkens and gets into a lot of the histories of what's happening or what has been happening, and 2 seasons of that. And I think that for me And again, as we talk about language, the podcast is primarily in Sheng. So again, thinking about ways in which we are really actually thinking about gathering and talking to each other. Yeah. So what different choices can we make?
Yeah, and I think something that question raised for me is that everything is economic as well. I mean, we're saying everything is political, but everything is economic as well. And unfortunately, the left, such as it is in the US, seems to have betrayed those principles. I mean, we talk about the left betraying those principles of labor, class struggle. We seem to give the Republicans a pass, but I don't know why. But yeah, I think it's also economic. So everything is political and economic at the same time. Any last questions before we wrap? Oh, great. Oh, 2. Okay. Where's the mic? We'll take the 2 and then we'll come back.
Thank you. Hi. So my name is Kathleen again. My question is in the context of resistance, and maybe just given what's happening in Kenya at the moment, what do you guys think would be different if we did have a history of recording resistance and how it has happened in the past? How do you think that would influence what is happening now? Thank you.
Thank you. Just there's someone behind you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Sagal, and I do believe that everything is political. And as you all say, politics is about the choices we make. And so I'm going to be the person that brings in the climate topic. And I'm curious how you all see the choices that have been made as a human race, but also as different communities and countries around the world about our relationship to the planet, nature, climate, and how that sort of features in your work, and how you see the political aspects of that. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those 2 questions. It's true, we talked this whole 30, 40 minutes without mentioning the climate even once. Thank you.
Thank you for both your questions. To the first question about better understanding context of resistance, I think so much of it is by design that we don't have access to those histories. A lot of that being suppressed, destroyed. But I also, at this moment, as much as it's a late arrival, I'm also welcoming the arrival of learning about those histories. Again, also part of this festival, there was one of the workshops yesterday that was also hosted by Ukombozi Library, and the work of archiving, of documenting, of in many ways making it possible for us to see this history. So again, thinking about the magic that librarians continue to make possible for us. I would say in some ways to based off of this festival, but also in other places, to try plug into the spaces of which a lot of those histories are being unearthed and made possible. I think the work of the African Digital Heritage is also quite wonderful in this universe of revisiting histories and making those known. In a way, also to maintain the motion, for me, something that I've been thinking about a lot more recently is reading in small groups. It doesn't necessarily have, I don't necessarily think of it as being the largest way to make change, but I think it's the thing that I can do at this moment. So I find that small motions in the direction of something, I think, has been very encouraging for my own practice and the people that I am in community with. So to your question around like the context of resistance, I think beginning with that curiosity and interest, and finding ways to disseminate that or engage with people around you as well has been one of the ways in which I'm thinking about that even more. Yes, and then to the second question around, or would you want to respond to that first? Okay. Yes, to the second question around climate change, and climate justice, I think it's in many ways, it can't be denied, which maybe should be the first thing we can say, that we are living on a planet that's not sustaining the way we think about our relationship to it. I think there are so many ways in which we can and should continue to learn from indigenous cultures that have the wisdom for how to live on Earth in sustainable ways. This one is a bit harder for me because I feel like there are ways in which there are small motions that we can continue to do, but I also think this is in some ways more like possibly to be done in a more global kind of like lobbying situation, because most of the damage that is happening with climate change is is happening based off of big industry. And so how do what are possibilities for effecting change in that way? And I think, I think that is a lot more organizing needs to go into that, or is going into that. So that would be the approach I'd think of.
Recording resistance historically, yes, I think, that would be transformative, until they find a way to fight that too. But you got to, every time they figure out something, we figure something out, there's a counter move. So we can't stop, rest on our laurels, as they say. But, the reason why I think about this idea of how important that having that history of recording resistance is because of how just transformative watching people do these things on TikTok have been, right? So that imagine if we'd had it all along, right? So that you could envision it so much more easily. There's a story, right, that the civil rights movement, which has existed as long as there has been, right, anti-Blackness in the United States, right? People have been resisting and fighting all along. But when do we see much more traction, right, in the United States in the late 1950s and 1960s? Is with the advent of television, recording all the ways in which the nonviolent resistance was being met with abject white supremacist violence. Right? When people could see it on their screens and hadn't yet been desensitized, right, that made a huge difference in building greater, right, investment in the idea of a civil rights movement, right, and the Civil Rights Act of 1964, so on and so forth. So yeah, I'm a big believer in that. Though it can't be the only kind of tool we use. Right? We got to use all the tools, right? Because when I think of when police racialized violence happens in their recordings, the way in which people then pick apart the recording to mean something else, like the police officers will tell you, no, that arm move meant this thing. And so that we're not even all seeing the same thing in the video itself. Even the video can be politicized, is another way of putting that. And then as far as climate justice is concerned, yes. And we particularly we saw this early on, right, in the environmental justice movement in the United States with regards to the people of color, right, fighting the ways in which all the toxic dumping was happening within the communities of color in the United States. We have long understood, right, that climate justice is racial justice.
Thank you so much. Please give them a very warm applause. We've run out of time, but thank you so much, Rosie. Thank you, Tanya, for your thoughtfulness. Thank you to the audience as well.